knowledge about cybersecurity. I only practiced part-whole thinking. Second, process and pointing to process are the categories we are making evolving in different ways. Malware, how is that evolving? Will malware überhaupt nog be relevant in 2 or 3 years? In what way do we take account of the future in defining the present parts? Very important if you think through the System 1 components. What is the level of maturity of these parts? These are all process-related questions, just allowing you to clarify, to point to the process dimensions. You haven't explained the process dimensions by asking those questions, but you bring them into the conversation to have a richer conversation. Relationship. What are the intrinsic relationships between the parts we must take into account? Are we neglecting some common ground between the parts? Simple, straightforward, relational questions. And how stable are the parts we are distinguishing in our operations? What is seeking equilibrium within each part and is subject of potential breakdown or collapse? Have the parts undergone sudden qualitative changes? Simple questions to start pointing and explore the field. And then we can go a bit deeper. In terms of context, we can ask, and these are only a few examples. The number of questions you can ask from each thought form is almost infinite the moment you start grasping the structure of that thought form. Can each part be described as a stable configuration? And can each part be described in terms of, in functional terms, in how it works? It very much surprised me when talking about the malware team in that cybersecurity department, that it seemed to me that highly schooled university mathematicians scanned the internet in a kind of an illogical way during whole days. Very boring work. And I asked the question, well, what is it in fact that system needs to produce? It's a very simple question, and you're all very familiar with that question. But still, it's often not embedded in a contextual exploration. A bit deeper in context, multiple contexts and frames of reference. What emerges if we can see the parts from different contexts? For example, from the availability of customer data, from necessary resources, from people capabilities. The P, the process point. How do the parts act upon each other? Are the shifting patterns of interaction over time? The embedding in process. Are the parts evolving in similar or different directions due to overarching developments or trends? And the relational ones. How precisely are the different parts related or different? Which relationships hold the different parts in place? And patterns of interaction and influence in relationship. How exactly can we describe the relationships between the parts? And are some relationships coming to the foreground or moving to the background? Imagine if you would have this information before really starting designing the System 1. It's not so difficult. It's just about asking about what is not yet there, what is not yet present in the thinking at that particular moment when you are engaging with, for example, your clients. So, mind-opening questions are derived from the thought forms, the structures of thinking. And they enable you to avoid the risk of oversimplifying and they increase, they augment the grammar of any model that you use, whether it's a Porter model or an agile model, whatever. You can approach each model from the thinking structures and immediately see what is absent. I was in November last invited for a congress on artificial intelligence, and to be honest, I knew nothing about artificial intelligence, but they asked me just to highlight how those experts were thinking. Experts in artificial intelligence were thinking about artificial intelligence, and I nearly missed my plane back because they thought I was a super expert in artificial intelligence, but I knew nothing about it, but I knew how I could listen to the structures in their thinking that they were using, and I just highlighted with questions what they did not think about at that moment, enabling us to have a more qualitative conversation. The only downside, if you start using thought structures, is that your interventions will become highly conceptual, and innovative thinking is indeed highly conceptual thinking. It enables also teams to follow different cognitive tactics compared to that they may be used to do so. They can choose to have a breadth first or a depth first search. The outcome will be the same. You will create progression in how they think about reality in complex ways. Now, some evidence. Why is this relevant? And before I started publishing on this, well, I'm coming from a university who's very evidence-driven. And they said, Jan, what you're talking about is pure philosophy. It's not relevant for the business. And since I'm a psychologist linked to an economist business school, I had to provide data. So it took me some time to figure out how I could create something that was relevant both for my academic colleagues and for my business clients. And well, since 2007 I've been doing some research on sustainable growth of companies, looking from an economical point of view in terms of future value creation and current value creation. And I'm using indicators used by financial analysts. For example, an indicator that enables you to tell you something about capturing current value is the net operating profit after taxes, or the EBIT, or the banking profit. Every sector, every industry has its own set of current value indicators found relevant. Future value indicators is about, for example, the development of the enterprise value versus the EBITDA expected for the next 12 months, or the price earnings multiple. If you gather data of companies within a sector over a number of years, let's say 5 to 10 years, it enables you to calculate averages and to position any company within the two dimensions. And if a company positions itself below the average, you can say on both axes, you can say, well, they are in a low growth situation. If they perform better on both axes versus their near competitors, over a longer period, you can say that that is a company in a sustainable growth. And my research has been focusing on highlighting and finding out whether sustainable growth companies have qualities that low growth companies have not. And as I'm also a teacher in human capital, I was wondering whether there are human capital practices that make the distinction between the two. And to be honest, I found out that there are. competency schemes, for example, are the most elaborated in low growth companies. So, if you as a society want to work on competency schemes, you might imagine that you're working on services that will not allow you to create any difference. But I will not comment on that anymore. You know, I was involved in with 2 clients, in fact 3 clients, at a similar moment in 2010. And these clients were Siemens and Rockwell Automation. And what struck me in preparing a top management seminar for both, and they provided me some strategic documents, and they provided me also with lots of published materials, their press releases, etc., etc. And what struck me was that the presence of thinking structures in those texts were quite different. In Rockwell Automation, and Rockwell Automation was positioned in 2010 in the sustainable growth segment, and that means that the average net operating profit per employee was $32,000 US. The net operating profit per employee for Siemens, which was positioned in the low growth segment, was 8,800 at the time. So it was a multiple of 4. And well, when I started turfing the thought structures in those texts, I saw a difference in how strong they were present, and in the fluidity, in the differences in different thought structures used. So I got the idea that I can perhaps look at company documents from a thinking structure perspective, not reviewing the content of what was in those annual reports, but looking at the structures, the thinking structures they used in those annual reports. There were a number of hurdles to overcome. One of them was that in different reporting jurisdictions, for example in Asia, companies put different things in their annual reports than in the United States, than in Europe, because legislation is different. So I needed to take that into account. And I could only do my analysis on the forward-looking statements. The statements where companies say we believe in, we expect to, and in the sustainability reporting. Then I had to find a coding system, and I used a table of 28 thought forms. So what I presented just a moment ago was a table of 12, but basically there is also a more elaborate table of 28 thought forms, and I start codifying the bits. For example, that bit was an illustration of this structure of thinking, and I produced some formulas. I calculated a fluidity or a diversity score, which is simply how much diversity in thinking structure is there in the report, and I calculated the whole systems breakthrough thinking index. I calculated a number of different indexes too, but I won't discuss them here. These are the companies that I chose. So I had 6 companies from Asia, 6 from Europe, and 12 from the United States. And I used 3 capturing or current value indicators and 2 future value indicators. And companies to be positioned in the sustainable or low growth segment had to be above the sector median for 4 out of those 5. That's how the linkings were made. What are the findings? Well, in low growth companies, the average fluidity or diversity score was significantly lower than the one in sustainable growth companies. And the whole systems breakthrough thinking index was also remarkably different. That means that somewhere the thinking of CEOs and CFOs, and why those two, these are the two who need to agree with the annual report, because a remark that I often got was, yes, but it's their marketing department who writes that annual report. And I said, yes, but that marketing department is a reflection of the thought structure of that CEO and that CFO, because that CFO will not allow anything in that report that he or she does not understand. So the thinking as reflected in the language used in annual reports points to differences in sense and meaning making, and in sustainable growth companies they seem to create a more complex picture of their world which they act upon. I can illustrate that with what that means for some companies, but given the time, a few words about the use. Basically, if you have an individual, because it starts with the individual, and this is a very bright student of mine who was identified as a corporate high potential, had a huge lean implementation project at the age of 35 and then got into a breakdown. What we did was, with my team, I developed a kind of a cognitive assessment. You can measure the thinking structures one uses. You can measure the fluidity of thinking, even of highly systemic thinkers. It's often surprising to see how narrow they think in their systemic thinking. But so you can measure it, and you can then start to deconstruct and reconstruct their thinking by getting them into a path of helping them to explore the bigger picture, the processes, the reframing opportunities, and so on. So going from what I call a downloading approach, that by this I mean working with one single view on reality, to a deeper thinking which is about multiple truths and opening of possibilities, and that's through mind-opening questions. The whole idea is that you can develop one's thinking through a set of phases, and different companies that I studied use at this moment in their leadership development practices at least 2 or 3 of the let's say developmental approaches that here come together in one scheme. It starts with changing the quality of the awareness of one's thinking, exploring the edges of one's thinking, then start to experiment with alternative logics, and then shift to a different kind of operating system, and this both in decision making, in conversations, and how they coordinate things. I have no time to illustrate what that means for Robert B., but that is discussed in my book. The broader use, I think, is very obvious. It's in creating new business models, in strategy development, in open innovation processes, in reorganization, and in team development. In teams, you can see what is clear in teams is that you often have a challenge the team is tasked to do, but the fluidity of thinking can be higher than the challenge or can be lower than the challenge. If the majority of the team members has a fluidity of thinking lower than the challenge, I call that downwardly organized teams, and they will continuously narrow the scope of the projects, while the others will continuously broaden the scope of projects. So the cognitive point of view enables you to understand really also the team dynamics involved. You can read more about that. One moment of, well, reclame. These are two books of my own teacher, Otto Laske. The best one is Dialectical Thinking for Integral Leaders, where you can go deeper into the 12 thought form scheme. So, if there are any questions, I will be happy to respond to them. Yes?
Very quick specific question on the model itself. The one that I didn't quite follow was in your breadth dimension you have a relationship element.
Yes.
And then in the depth you have a linking element.
Yes.
And I wasn't sure how to distinguish between the two.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's the linking one will push you a bit further in terms of in relationship, for example, it's linking the different relational or systemic constellations, while in the pointing to, you will point to often one systemic constellation.
Sorry, but so not between linking and pointing. Mm-hmm. So in depth, when I go to the lowest level of depth of thinking, I'm looking at how things link together. So,
yes.
But then in the breadth,
yes,
you also have moving from context to process to relationship. Yes. So I'm wondering, how does the relationship in the breadth dimension of thinking relate to the linking in the depth? How do you distinguish between those two dimensions?
By the type of questions. But then I will need to really have an in-depth conversation about that.
Maybe for lunch.
Yeah. Yes?
Did your research identify any data that would differentiate between conscious thinking and unconscious thinking that's actually in the individual's makeup, and conscious thinking that they have learned or developed?
My research did not take into that into account. What I see in my practice is that often if you start using mind-opening questions, that what was practiced in an unconscious way becomes conscious, okay, and becomes qualitatively better. Yeah. But it's very difficult to research something what is not yet made explicit, yeah, because while researching it, you influence your subject, and so your research is not neutral anymore. Yes, Patrick?
Jan, you said you've done research, sort of desk research on reports, and
mm-hmm,
we've done similar exercises on strategic plans, and it's shockingly revealing, isn't it? Have you done the equivalent in watching a board or a management team and seen in action the narrowness or breadth of the thinking?
Yes.
Breadth in the widest
well, to be honest, I have been part of several boards myself, with even a couple of captains of industry in Belgium. And what always strikes me is that someone who receives the label of captain of industry, when you have that person into your board, that often those persons open the minds and think already very dialectical and inspire others. The cry for independent board members is valuable as long as those independent board members have a breadth first and a depth first search approach that goes deeper and broader than the board already in place, and then they start to add value. If this is not the case, it simply doesn't make sense to add persons. But it's well, sometimes astonishing how narrow also boards think, and when you start applying and help them becoming conscious about the narrowness. Of course, I do not say your thinking is very narrow. I'm just practicing mind-opening questions, and then suddenly the whole conversation shifts. So I don't know whether that's an answer to your question.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah. Yes.
Do you see any relationships between this map you've presented, this framework, and conventional ideas of intelligence, people's intelligence? Because it strikes me that this sort of structure is available to all.
It is available to all, indeed. The traditional approach to intelligence is a very logical one. That means that A is always A and can never be non-A. The thought structures that I'm presenting basically allow you to explore everything what is not yet A, which surrounds A, the context of A, and you need to understand what is around A to fully grasp A. That's the dialectic, and that dialectic basically is very present in children's minds, but gets kind of pushed out of our mind by our educational system. And if you look at how the educational system in China, for example, is organized, Chinese think already very dialectical by nature. We are very logical thinkers by nature, but you have that use of thought structures better practiced in Asia than in Western countries at this moment. And in that sense, we've done one experiment in a school in Belgium, trying to teach or reteach children the thought structures, and it's amazing how fast they can do that. But it gets very threatening for the teachers, because suddenly they get children that appear to be more intelligent than themselves, but they are not. They are simply using a different set of thought templates. Yeah? What's the question over there?
It's a long question, but what's the chance that the map is actually comprehensive if you do the reflexive bit and ask what's not on the map?
Well, I'm sure that the map is incomplete. And if I read things, I always try to understand. For example, I had the opportunity to do some work with Eve Middleton Keller from London School of Economics, who's highly involved in complexity theory and complexity thinking. Well, she opened my eyes to some thought structures that were not yet present in the map. So what I projected today was a 12-structure map. Together with my colleagues, we have developed a 28-structure map, and probably in 2-3 years, or even in 5 years, there might be a 36-structure map, because
I want it to be in different dimensions.
Perhaps, well, why not? I think everything that we produce is incomplete, and we should take notice about that. Yeah. Yeah.
Last question.
There's a seductive aspect to transformation, and it's become a bit of a cliche term because it gets overused and becomes meaningless, and it seemed quite clear what you meant by it. But I wonder what your thoughts were on the less transformational examples that might still purport to be transformational. I mean, everybody sort of says we want to transform and sort of be completely different, but actually the companies that you sort of described in the non-transformational column might also suggest that they were attempting to transform as well, and the consultancies that were working with them would also be trying to transform them. And so I guess I wonder what your thoughts are on the acceptability of corporations not trying to transform, but perhaps attempting to achieve incremental change, and whether the kind of control aspect that you described around the CEOs and their level of control over the organisational plans and the kind of capability metrics that float with that being effectively quite a robust set of parameters that would prevent transformation from happening.
I'm not sure I'm quite understand your question, but let me react to certain sub-dimensions in your question. My argument is not an argument for transformation or not transformation. My argument is an argument to become conscious about how you are thinking about reality. And the intent you might have, the intent of incremental change or transformation, is out of the model that I'm presenting. I have no value statement at all whether a company should transform or not. What I see is that a lot of companies saying that they are willing to transform often are limited in their thinking structures and only use contextual or process thought structures and miss the point completely in relational and transformational thought structure. The dimension of instability, for example, is completely absent in Kotter's change logic.
I guess maybe my question is more about then whether there is a level of honesty. So if as a CEO I sort of admit I'm a megalomaniac and I need to control everything, and it's limited to my own views of how the world could be, that's kind of quite an unappealing message. It's more appealing to control everything but say that we're trying to transform.
Yeah. But you know, the first thing you will always approach a client with is the question, how can I help you? And even that CEO will put something on the table which has a concept that you can start probing. And that's where you start. I never say to a CEO, well, you know, I think you're a very narrow thinker. You should change your thinker. That's a setup for failure. You take what is on the table, what is made explicit, and go take it from there onwards. And sometimes it happens that a CEO or even a management team says, well, you know, we are not up to that kind of questioning. It's too abstract. I said, well, that's fine for me.
How can I help you?
Yeah, indeed.
I think what you're pointing to in this bit of conversation is some of the challenges that people like Bill Talbot have come up against. So his framework of action logics and people transitioning from pre-conventional to conventional to post-conventional thinking. And one of the challenges about some of these frameworks is that if you are somebody whose thinking has arrived at that broader capacity, that depth and breadth of capacity to think as you're suggesting in that transformational space, not everybody's arrived there. So we're actually talking about paradigm shifts. And what we know about paradigm shifts, if you haven't arrived there, you can't do it. So you don't recognize other people and how they may get. So there's one of the things I found with using Talbot's work is that I actually have to be quite sensitive and sometimes careful about even introducing the frame, because if people haven't arrived at that capacity to do it, then speaking from that place is like going blah 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 blah.
That's correct, and you know it raises an interesting question, whether or how can you develop one's thinking? And we all know that there is much more than only thinking structures. There is also a whole social emotional maturity, which Torbert has highlighted. And the interesting question that is pursued in adult development research for the moment is what drives what? Is the social emotional maturity part driving the development of thinking, or vice versa? Is the thinking driving the social emotional maturity development? And
that becomes problematic, because what we start getting into is, well, if this, then that.
Yes.
Already with proper
indeed.
As if we can determine the transformation itself. And actually, if we truly hold into complexity principles, we can't. We can't ever know what's going to support somebody to make that tick.
That's correct.
Into a broader capacity.
That's correct. I can only agree.
It's a paradox.
Yeah.
Can we?
We can continue in the break.
Costas, very quickly.
Our last question.
One very quick one, connecting to the previous one. I think I just want your comment. There is one part which I didn't identify on the structure of this thinking, which is the individual. or the observer, or the consultant, or the person who's exploring all this area through his questions. So is there something you develop, or is it something to think about? Because we're talking about systems, we're talking about systemic thinking. The way we structure our questions is deeply affected by who we are.
Of course.
And so that creates another kind of system which involves us. So what do you think about that?
Well, from practice, the only thing that I can say is that becoming aware of your own thinking structures and getting in touch with them enables you to make more specific and focused interventions, and will allow you to ask better questions given the context you're in. But, well, it's about becoming aware of what you're thinking about what you're thinking about. Yeah?
Okay, can we...
Okay.
All time? So, Jan, you're here for lunch, so people can bend your ear and ask you questions.
Okay.
At lunchtime, yeah?
They can. So, thank you.
And